Hey, Katie, welcome to the sisterhood.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You're no stranger to sisterhoods. It's kind of the waters you swim in.
This is true. This is true. I get to speak to sororities nationwide, really. Been about 50 schools at this point. So sisterhood is something I love. I think it's so powerful. Power of sisters is something I often hashtag. And I really believe there's beauty in lifting each other up and seeing in each other what we sometimes can't see in ourselves.
Yeah, so how did you get into this work?
Oh my goodness. I mean, there's so many Genesis moments. But let's see, to kind of give you the short version, I never went through sorority recruitment. Like, it wasn't even on my radar. God is hilarious like this. And I had some girls show up at my door my freshman year in college with clapping hands and balloons and offered me a snap bid, which essentially just means you don't have to go through recruitment. They come and they offer you a bid. And I told them no. But as again, God gets us where we want to go even more than we want to go. Oftentimes, I ended up reluctantly saying yes. And it ended up, as crazy as it sounds, being my first opportunity to belong to something bigger than myself. I had never really been involved in church. I never really involved in sports or anything. And all of a sudden, I was a part of 120 girls who wore these same letters on our chest that I didn't even know how to pronounce at the time. But we stood for the same goals. We wanted similar life, things together. And it was just a really, really eye-opening opportunity for me and one of the best things that ever happened. So, but I left that 4 years behind me in college, went, grew up, so to speak, got married, did my regular life. And then I was about 30 years old and had a total meltdown in our walk-in closet. I hope that someone out there can relate to one of those good old-fashioned meltdowns where you like throwing a sweater into the floor and all of the good stuff. And essentially, meltdown was started because I was being a quote good Christian girl, doing all the good Christian things and exhausted and depleted and felt like I was getting nowhere and just, God, can't you see me? Can't you see how hard I'm working? Specifically, I had helped a girl get out of homelessness and she let all of the pieces fall right in front of me and didn't care as much as I cared. And I'm just like, and in that moment, if I have ever been sure I've heard the voice of God, it was then. And he said, when did I ever ask you to do any of this? Share your story with sorority women. That is what I have designed you to do. And I was like, drop the mic. Okay. Didn't even know what that meant, but that was the Genesis moment. And then from there, the doors really just started opening up. It was like, hey, I hear you're a yoga instructor, which I had become at the time. Can you come do a yoga class for our sisters? Yes, I can.
Mm-hmm.
Which turned into meeting the president, which turned into, hey, I have this passion. Do you think maybe I could talk to your girls at some point? Yeah, sure. The floor is yours. 200 girls, go ahead. And I'm like, wait, what? And then I started talking more and more and started people reaching out at different schools. And here we are, 50 colleges later, and a book and a podcast. And I get the opportunity to be who I needed when I was younger to a bunch of sorority women.
Well, Alex and I both were in a sorority, so we can relate. We went to the same college and different sororities, but same experience. So, and then you also are getting your PhD. Can you talk about that?
No.
Okay.
That's a misconception. I work with a PhD of sexual health, and I did a video saying what I learned from working with a PhD of sexual health that got widely misinterpreted when it hit 3 million views, where it was like, I work with a PhD and the human, not a piece of paper.
Okay, that's interesting because even I thought you were getting a PhD.
I've addressed it in the comments. I'm not sure how much of a big deal I should make about it at this point, but yes, that is where we are. I work with another human who is a PhD.
It took me a minute. I figured it out when I saw that, but it did take me a minute. I was like, wait, what? Wait, she's doing a lot is what was my first thought. She's really going for it.
I sat down to say a video, what I learned from working with a PhD, never occurred to me that people would take it differently. But yeah, that video between Reels and TikTok has 5 million views. So when you get that right of an audience and you got 30 seconds to explain yourself, people read different things.
Yeah.
Well, and just say very quickly what it's about, because it really has to do with our topic today.
Sure. Yeah. So as I said, I've weekly had calls with a doctor who it's just fascinating because I have studied dating and how it relates to helping women through this navigating these waters. It's such a hot topic when I get to talk to my college student women. And so this doctor of sexual health, basically he has all kinds of science to back up all the things I've been saying for years. And so I'm so fascinated. But essentially the video that we're talking about specifically is this hormone called vasopressin, which has been known about for years. It has to do with water absorption, but the recent research also is kind of unlocking how it has to do with bonding, particularly with men. And the research shows that men bond more the longer they date versus having a hookup quickly. That does not allow the men have time to have this bond, like, this is my girl, this is my woman, I want to protect her, I want to honor her and get to know her more. The hormones do not work in his favor when that happens too quickly. So yes, of course, you can imagine this had a lot of feedback because it's like, wait, what? Like, hookup culture is not working? First of all, a lot of people, that explains a
Newsflash.
lot. And then the other people were like, no, it doesn't. So yeah, I never saw all that coming. I've never had anything go viral. So that's been an experience.
Yeah.
Wow. So you had people defending hookup culture.
Oh, girl, I've been wanting to hide. Like, yes. Oh, for sure. Lots of people like, oh, we hooked up on the first night and we've been together for 10 years or whatever. And of course that happens because they continue to date and they continue to get to know each other. But that happens in very few of the instances. And it's much easier for the men to form a bond if that doesn't happen, because men are wired to pursue and date and romance and win over the woman's heart, versus this hookup culture that tells us something very different.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, I mean, I don't even remember at this point, over 5,000 comments of, this explains so much, thank you for this, versus, you're a liar, liar, pants on fire. And I'm like, I just stopped looking at the comments for my own mental health.
Mm-hmm.
But overall, for sure, by and large, people have been like, thank you for saying this. And that is why I'm doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, can you talk to us about what are the trends in dating? I mean, as someone who studies this stuff and you're up on the latest, so what are the trends you're seeing in teenagers?
Well, it's a gamut. I feel like there's still, we have people will say things are getting worse. And I like to fight that because I really see that you see what you're looking for, right? And every generation has said, oh, the young people these days, it's all their fault and they're going to hell in a handbasket. And I see a lot of good in our young people. And now, of course, you see what you're looking for. So hookup culture is, actually, it's not even on the rise. There are less people hooking up. There are less teenagers hooking up and teen pregnancies than there were in the 90s when I was in school. So that's good news. I think that's because of science. And actually, research shows us that women instinctually know that that's not good for us, which makes sense because studies also show us that a man and woman together present in the household are what's good for children. Let's remember that sex makes children. So all of this instinctually makes sense to not, partake in a hookup culture. But to answer your question, I see the gamut. One thing I have noticed is that romance is not as celebrated or enforced or whatever you want to call it. A lot of times, even the girls that I'm close with that mentoring and stuff, that they'll hear from a guy, hey babe, can I get your Snapchat? Instead of, I'd like to take you on a date. Okay, at some point, can we get coffee? And so there's a lot of the Snapchatting or texting for weeks, months on end before there's any kind of, are we taking this to the next level? Do you like me? Do I like you? Are we going forward with this? And so the talking stage, this ambiguous, are you keeping your options open? Or are you interested in me stage, strings specifically the women on for a long time. And that is very frustrating. But I tell the women, like, well, who says you can't say, hey, let's talk about this. Where are we going? What's important to you? Are we moving forward or are we just going to Snapchat forever? Because I got a life to live. So I encourage women to stand up for themselves as it relates to that. But yeah, anyway, that's kind of what I'm seeing. The romance culture isn't what it used to be, but I don't think that it is all lost.
It's interesting that you say that. Because it's true. I feel like there's a lot of these budding relationships, they get to know each other through a virtual platform first
Yeah.
before they start spending time together. And that is unique to the digital natives. That's not something that has happened in previous generations. And so I'm really curious what the impact is. Does it work? Does it not work? Is it real? Is it not real? I mean, how do we help our kids kind of sift through all that?
Yeah, I think we're still finding it out, right? Because this is kind of our first generation that Snapchatted and did FaceTime before they haven't ever met in real life. And that was one of the popular comments on the TikTok. It was like, oh, well, can the men form a bond if we date, quote, virtually for 2, 3, 5 months? I don't know if the bonds are as tight as if having coffee in real life. I imagine, if we're comparing apples and apples, it's going to be less because you're not seeing a 3D human being. But I do think that for sure you can get to know people just as you and I are doing now. And video is the next best thing to real life interaction. And thankfully for that, in this middle of this COVID stage, that we have, technology and stuff. So I don't think that um, getting to know each other through this digital age and quote dating, but it's not bad. But obviously, when it's when it's available and you can meet in real person, I would definitely advise that. But then, like another point to that is the good news is you can stalk someone on social media and find out all kinds of good stuff before you ever agree to a date, which is a plus than whatever I had. When I was dating, I remember I went on a first date and someone kind of hooked us up on a blind date, and I'm like insulted. He was like definitely not even close to being my type. But had I had all the ways to stalk him beforehand, that date would have never happened. It wasn't like a mean guy or anything, but all that being said, the plus is you can do a little homework, but the minus is real life is you can never replace real life.
Mm-hmm. I have heard that during COVID, more young adults and adults have been dating virtually so that when they actually do meet face to face for the first time, they've had this back and forth and they know, oh, I want to invest my time in you and I want to take this COVID risk for adults to be in person with you. And I know that you've been isolating because we've been talking every night for the last month. And so I've just heard some experts say that in some ways it is slowing down the hookup culture for older people because they aren't spending as much time together and they're not spending as much spontaneous time together. Mm-hmm. So I wonder how that trickles down to teenagers too.
Yeah, actually, I really love that point. And as we talked about dating, getting to know each other, that is something that isn't talked about enough. And young people, teenagers, anyone who's dating, if you get the opportunity to get to know someone, having a FaceTime or Zoom date, like that's amazing. And another thing that people don't talk about is we often only think of intimacy as physical, but there are mental, emotional, spiritual, and social forms of intimacy. And just getting to know that other human being, because we are more than just our body, right? We are more than just our physical being. We have interests, we have passions. There's so much to us. And through that screen to screen, what lights you up? But like what gets you out of bed in the morning? What are you excited about? Not even being able to hold hands, like put the physical to the side and get to know that person. And I think that's awesome because young people, especially, hormones are a real thing, and it is okay to have that attraction. It means that your body is working normally, but we know for sure that when I always talk about, we have the physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, and social forms of intimacy. If you only have physical, then you're left with a mess, the MESS. So getting to know you as the full human being is so vitally important. And that is able to happen so much more through the digital interaction. So yes, I think that that's a great thing.
So what would you say are healthy dating habits for kids, and how, I mean, most of the people listening are parents. And so how do you as a parent help your teenager really practice the healthy dating habits, and how do you even teach that to them when really they want to do it all on their own?
So you get a storm shelter underneath the ground and lock them in there. I'm just kidding.
Which is what a lot of people want to do.
Yes, we have 2 daughters. They're not at that stage yet, but yes, I understand. So I have studied this so much because I've been doing mentoring for years, and I always watch the girls who they're dating and they're growing up and they're becoming the kind of young women that you want your daughters to be, you know? And I'm always looking, is there a formula? Like, were they homeschooled? Were they public schooled? Like, give me the formula to see how I can make our girls turn out this way. And unfortunately, there is no formula because we are working with the gift of free will. So we have human beings who are human beings. So the one thing I have found that is at least helpful in a large way is, what does it say? More is caught than taught. So parents who model a healthy dating relationship, you know, Andy Stanley says that the best thing you can give your kids is a good marriage. And that's not to anyone feel guilty if they have walked through divorce, because we're all human beings here. But being able to model what that looks like in your own marriage, if that's available, and if not, just studying that. You know, actually the best relationship we have is with Jesus. And so he's the king of romance and the king of our hearts. And so what does that look like to have a loving relationship with him for the mom or dad? And how are we pursuing that daily? Because ultimately, I think that marriage, dating, which ultimately leads to marriage, is our best relationship on this earth to show us how much God loves us. And I mean, who else is going to do that except our spouse? And we get the opportunity daily to show them what unconditional love looks like. So all that to say, I think that being able to model that in a healthy way, and then also just communicate what it looks like for them to have a long-term way of thinking. So a lot of times a 17-year-old won't be thinking, I'm looking for a future father one day. They're not thinking, I'm looking for someone who is responsible with money, who's going to protect my body, who has the same shared faith, you know, all these huge things that you want to make sure are foundational when it comes to dating relationship. So helping them thinking long term, and then, oh, mom, whatever, I'm just having fun. I would like to challenge that, because fun is adorable and everything, but fun leads to emotions tied up. It leads to friends intertwined, and 3 months, 6 years, a year, or a year later, and if you're just, quote, having fun, you can easily lead to heartbreak if you don't have some parameters around what matters to you in a dating relationship. What are you, we're on a path, right? We're on a path. If you're on a path to eventually find a marriage partner, that means you probably don't want to date the guy who is addicted to pornography and cusses at his mama. I mean, I just don't know any girls who go into a dating relationship saying that they're looking for that. Yet girls date guys like that because they walk into dating without a plan. So thinking long term and then being able to model that are my 2 biggest pieces of advice.
It's definitely, though, like, hard to know those things, you know, like, it's hard to know if the person you're dating is addicted to pornography, for example, because that's not something
They're
people
not gonna
share,
on the first date.
and not something that, you know, I mean, those are hard things to know. And so I guess what would be some warning signs for that, or for other things that you caution people about? And I don't want to just speak to girls. I want to speak to, you know, to our sons as well. But what would you say are kind of the factors to look for?
I mean, pornography, obviously there's a lot to unpack there, but so knowing what matters to you and then deciding if there's red flags. So for example, if having someone who has a shared faith as you, I would have told you having a Christian guy was very important, but I would make excuses for a guy who says, yes, I'm a Christian because my grandma went to church, and there's no evidence in his life that he was growing toward faith. So not only just saying, is it important to you to have a guy who has a shared faith? If so, what does that look like? Does it mean that he's growing in his faith, or does it mean that he says his grandma went to church? Because those are 2 very different things. Pornography, you know, I don't know, there's so much there. And this is, gosh, we live in a world where, you know, when I was growing up, you had to go buy this magazine and hand dollars to an actual human being, and there was a little bit of shame involved. Now these little computers in our pockets are able to access things at all times. So really there's a war out there for our young men, and just praying for what they're going through. But I always say that the beauty is almost everyone I've ever mentored says that they want to be seen as the only woman in his world. If I'm talking to a girl, or for a guy, I want to be seen as the only woman in her world. So this, as Andy Stanley says, exclusivity is the fuel for romance. So, and that's every romantic song and every romantic movie. So when we're looking for being seen as that one and only, then we don't get there by having lots and lots and lots of exes. And, I'm not saying you can date, like all that's good and get to know each other, but having less comparison is very, very helpful, because then you are my definition of beauty. You are my one and only, especially as it relates to physical intimacy. So, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but these are hard things. And I wish there was a t-shirt. Hey, these are all my issues. This is what I'm working through. Also the conversation of grace, that we're all going to bring some baggage into a relationship, and it's deciding what we're willing to work through together. I did a podcast episode where we talked about this a little bit more. And I said, like, some huge red flags are if they're lying to you or hiding a potential, drug addiction or any kind of addiction, then those are like, you don't need to know, no, and no. But if it's like, I'm honest about it, this is what I'm struggling with, this is how I'm getting help, this is how I'm improving, I would like your support in this, that's a much better conversation than I'm lying and I'm hiding it. So, I wish it was easier, but those are maybe two big ways to kind of pivot that conversation.
Mm-hmm. What would you say is maybe some help parents navigate? Like, I want to give my teens freedom, but I also want to set them up for success and not make it where I'm really not having any boundaries, because then really you're kind of setting them up for failure. So do you have some guardrails that you talk about that are healthy?
I love that you mentioned guardrails. I love that analogy. But I think that teenagers earn trust, and then so they earn trust by their behavior. And so maybe more time to stay out, or, you said you were going where you said you were going to go, that kind of stuff. And so then perhaps more leash can be given, so to speak. And then, but you can maybe start small, like tonight you're going to Sarah's house to hang out at her get together. You're going to be home by 10, and then making sure all of that happens. And then, perhaps you can go from there. Teenager is such a landmine of years. And I am already praying for our girls when we get there. I think that I say this is maybe too simple, but being on your knees for them, because temptation is infinitely easier to avoid than to overcome. Just not being at those parties where those questionable activities are happening is going to be so much safer than trying to be the strong person at said party. Praying for their friendships, because our friendships are hugely impactful in that stage. And, again, you can't control all of that, because I get it. If you take away, her friend who is a terrible influence, but she loves her, that is complicated. But continually maybe hanging out with families where they have kids that you really look up to or admire. And again, I know this is so complicated, because there's going to be a friend who she's raised in the church, but that she's not really living the way she's supposed to be, but you love her parents, and like, how do you draw these lines? And I wish I had a magic ball and all the perfect answers, but I would just say pray, like on your knees, because it's a battlefield out there. I truly have been convicted so much lately of this like armor of God, like, because we're at battle and our children are at battle. And, the devil, I think sex is his playground. And if we confuse and cheapen this gift and, make it not a big deal, yet it is, then our young people are just confused. And dating, and as that relates to what you want in your future relationships, because all of that adds up. Like, there's who you date when you're 17 is going to probably affect who you date when you're 19, and all of these things that you walk through. And so having that long-term thinking, protecting your path, and then just praying for your babies, that's my best suggestion.
What do you say about, Alex and I actually just on this week's podcast, we were talking about just the normalization of, like, not just like seeing sex on a scene of, let's say, a movie or a TV series. Now it's like graphic and it's often violent and it's like very different. It's very different than it used to be. And this is what our kids are seeing, and this is what is being normalized. And I think one of my questions is, sex is normalized in their world as teenagers growing up. It is. It's all over. It is on the internet. It is on Netflix, on Prime. And so, and also their peers. I mean, just statistically, there are very few kids coming out of high school who have not had sex. And so, how do we kind of walk our kids through these really, as you were saying, this minefield, where sex has really been twisted and the norm is totally different now. And yes, like in previous generations, like, like you said at the beginning of the interview, sure, every generation has said, this generation has kind of pushed the limits of our generation. But there are, because of media and because of the access to this ubiquitous technology, there is a different norm around sex. And so, how do we help our kids navigate that?
Oh my goodness. Yeah. First, I would say a lot of parents think that they're going to have a talk with their kids. I'm putting that in air quotes, a talk with their kids about sex. And no, it's a conversation. It's an ongoing conversation. So, I know my parents didn't really have that conversation with me at all, or talk, or whatever you want to call it. But whatever we have, whatever that dialogue is with our children, it's not, hey, honey, this is how babies are made. This is an ongoing conversation. So that's the first thing I would say. And one thing that I talk about often is, okay, we see this graphic movie and this very questionable way that this couple is relating on the screen. Who made that movie and what were their motives? Because I work in marketing and have my whole grown up life, and I've never once heard of a boardroom getting together and be like, hey, we are going to get together and make a movie demonstrating how young people can have healthy relationships. No, they are not thinking about that. They are thinking, how can we push the envelope and make people say, oh my gosh, this is so scandalous, because then they can get free advertising and laugh all the way to the bank and make millions of dollars, because people will show up to see what all the fuss is about and buy the t-shirts and the soundtracks and everything else. And they are in that boardroom dreaming up how to make dollar bills, y'all.
Mm-hmm.
They are not dreaming up how can we best communicate what it looks like to have a healthy dating relationship for 16-year-olds. I mean, they're just not. And so we look at stuff, and media is powerful. It is so powerful. And I am angered that the enemy has used it to confuse and cheapen this gift called sex. But maybe just having that conversation to help the teenagers be like, yeah, but what are their motives? Who's behind that? What's their agenda? Is it for your best interest? No. Well, you know what? I'm your mama, and I would climb the highest mountain and swim the deepest sea for you, because I have your best interest at heart. And better than that, your heavenly Father does. And he says that ain't good for you. It's not good for a future marriage. And side note, look at most celebrities who have lived this lifestyle who are suicidal and drug addicts. So if that's what we want, if money, fame, sexy glamour is the goal, that doesn't seem to be working out for the people who have it. So those are logical explanations. I know sometimes romance and pretty things on the media sometimes don't make that conversation so easy. But I do have good news. It's all very in the infancy stages, but have a friend who is working on a documentary talking about how hookup culture is not healthy. So perhaps the media will be adding that voice to all of the other voices as well.
Because I think the cultural norm is starting to evaluate that and say it even apart from a faith conversation, that just society is starting to see. And I was just even telling someone the other day that being in my mid 40s, I feel like I'm more open to talk about my faith at this stage of my life, because so many of my peers that aren't believers have made decisions and they have seen the aftermath of the decisions they've made. And so my life has more credibility now, because that question of how's that working out for you is there. And so what I hear you saying, because sometimes we will watch something and we'll push the pause button and we'll go into parent mode and say, now, what do you think of this? How's this working out for them? And we are quickly labeled judgy by our children. And so I think what has helped is to just kind of ask that question, how is that working out for them in this moment? Like, and how realistic is it if the reactions are not, would you feel the same way if you found out he had done that? And to do it in question form, because I think as parents, we can start to go into lecture form, because we quickly want to erase the messaging that we're seeing on the screen and say, oh, no, that's not good. This is better for you. Instead of just taking a deep breath and saying, this is a lifelong conversation. This isn't going to be our only moment to talk about this. And ask those questions with some open-ended and allowing them to have opinions, which gets really hard too, because sometimes they defend behavior that we think is awful and terrible and destructive. And it hurts our heart to think that they might see that as a model for how they make decisions. And yet we need to give them that space, or we just get shut down because we are being lecturers. Yeah. So that's just my confession in my own struggle as a mom, is to give them that space to have opinions that are different than mine.
No, I love that. That's what the good counselors do, right? They don't tell you, they listen to you, and they help you find the answer on your own. So one of the favorite things I like to say is people will say, well, what do you think about if I move in with my boyfriend? Well, what story do you want to tell about your dating relationship to your future kids? And they're like, fine, I know the answer. I didn't say anything. I just asked you what story you want to tell. And so asking those questions will sometimes the hard work is done because they know the answers, hopefully, or at least help them.
And then they're making the decisions, which if they make the decisions, then that's what they decide. If you make it for them, they may actually do the opposite just because you made it for them.
Moms these days.
Because that's human nature right there. Okay, so I do have just a last question for you, and that is, how can we as parents love and embrace well the boyfriends and girlfriends that our kids have?
Oh, that's so good. Yeah. I don't, it's so funny. I'm not quite to this stage, but I've thought about this often. What would that look like? And it's hard because, you feel like no one can love your baby as much as you can, right? But I think just letting your child clearly communicate what's important to them. And hopefully they clearly communicate what's important to their boyfriend or girlfriend. And then getting to know that person. Of course, I think that it would be very helpful, as it sounds like you do, inviting them into your lives, dinner tables, family get-togethers or whatever. And then, just you would communicate your love for them. And I think that that's contagious. And I think that they see like how precious that child is to you, and hopefully communicates, you better not mess with my baby. But at the same time, this boyfriend or girlfriend is someone else's child, and your son or daughter is dating them. So it goes both ways. And that is just with respect and letting your child, again, know what matters to them. And then hopefully, I have a friend I interviewed on my podcast. She kind of famously on a reality show, she said she was waiting for marriage, and it got like, what? Oh, on this reality show, and she said that she would always go into a relationship saying, oh, where do you go to church? If that's important to you, blah, blah. Oh, cool. Yeah. Well, I decided that I'm waiting to marriage. That's something that's really important to me. And they'd either be like, cool, or they'd be like, bye. And then bye. So who cares? Like brush. There's other fish in the sea. You're not going to like change your standards for one person. Anyway, that's kind of off subject, but just communicating clearly what matters to you, and then being able to love the person that they love because of all of those discussions have been had.
Yeah. One thing I always say is that for as long as we get them, right? Because it's most likely in the teenage years, sometimes it's not this way. Sometimes the first girlfriend or boyfriend is the one that they marry, but more often than not, it's not. And so I always say that for as long as we get them, I want them to truly see and experience and feel the love of Christ
Yeah.
and through us. And that if that's all that we give them and that's all that we leave them with, then we have, we have done what we were called to do for the amount of time that we were given with that person. And of course, it's hard. I mean, I will say, one of the hardest things about my kids breaking up with their significant other at the time is I've gotten really attached.
Oh,
And it's like heartbreaking for me because I have grown to love this person. And just because they break up doesn't mean I've stopped loving that person. I may have to do it more from afar after they break up, which is hard. But I have, I've stood in a hallway with, a former girlfriend, and we both just cried because it's like a heartbreak. But I just pray that they will have experienced the love of Christ through us in even a small way. And so I think that gives us a little bit of a bigger vision too, as we're navigating dating relationships with our teenagers, that this person may only be in our life for a short window, but in that window, can we truly show them something that's unique? And that is the love of Christ. So anyway, that's one of the things that we've really tried to do.
no, I love that. I'm going to reach out to you for advice when that day comes for our girls.
Well, Katie, this has been great. Thank you so much for coming on. And I think even as teenagers grow up, you are a great resource for young people. And so where can people find you?
Thank you. At Katie Bulmer Life is my Instagram and social media and all of that good stuff. And then katiebulmer.life is my website.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Katie. We sure appreciate it. We wish you
Yeah.
the best.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Bye.